Sweating sickness, the mysterious scourge of the Tudors among the many diseases that haunted medieval England. Few were as sudden, mysterious, or terrifying as the sweating sickness, sometimes referred to as the English sweat. Emerging shortly after the rise of the Tudor dynasty in 1485, this enigmatic illness struck with such speed and brutality that many victims perished within mere hours of showing symptoms. The first outbreak coincided with the aftermath of the Battle of Bosworth Field, where Henry Tudor defeated Richard III and claimed the English throne. Some believe the disease was brought over by Henry's own troops from the continent, though no cases were recorded among the French mercenaries he employed. Whatever its origin, the disease swiftly took hold in London and spread like wildfire. What made sweating sickness particularly terrifying was the rapid onset and high mortality. The illness often began with a sudden sense of dread or anxiety, almost as though the body sensed what was coming. Within minutes to hours, victims experienced violent chills, headaches, muscle and joint pain, followed by a searing fever. Then came the profuse sweating, which gave the disease its name. Victims would be drenched, exhausted, gasping for breath, and sometimes delirious. It wasn't just the physical toll, it was the psychological horror. Victims would feel fine in the morning and be dead by nightfall. The speed at which the disease worked defied all understanding. In some cases, individuals collapsed in the streets or died in their beds, soaked in sweat, gasping in vain for air. Many were so afraid that they refused to sleep, believing that doing so would hasten death. This strange disease displayed an even stranger selectivity. It disproportionately affected the wealthy and noble classes, particularly young Englishmen in the prime of their lives. Infants, the elderly, and the peasantry were far less impacted. Foreigners living in England were largely unaffected, and regions like Scotland, Wales, and Ireland were spared almost entirely. This inexplicable pattern only deepened the mystery. Whole households would be emptied in a matter of days. Nobles fled cities in panic, abandoning courts and estates. Universities closed. Public gatherings were canceled. King Henry VII himself reportedly lived in isolation for fear of catching the disease. Fear reigned supreme. No one could explain what caused it. Was it divine punishment for the sins of the elite? A poison from foreign lands? Some blamed miasma, bad air, while others thought it might be tied to planetary misalignment. In the absence of science, people turned to astrology, alchemy, and superstition for answers. Physicians, often powerless in the face of such rapid mortality, prescribed a variety of treatments. Herbal tonics were popular. Infusions of sage, wormwood, and rue were used to induce vomiting or sweating in an attempt to purge the sickness. Bloodletting was also common, but dangerous. In truth, no treatment proved effective. The disease killed indiscriminately and instantly. The worst part? The sweating sickness didn't come just once, it returned in waves. After the initial outbreak in 1485, subsequent epidemics struck in 1507, 1517, 1528, and 1551. Each time, it returned without warning and disappeared just as mysteriously. The 1528 outbreak was especially devastating, spreading beyond England into Germany and the Low Countries before vanishing. The final epidemic occurred in 1551, after which the disease disappeared from recorded history. Modern researchers have speculated that it may have been a form of hantavirus or some other now extinct pathogen, but there is no definitive evidence. Its sudden appearance and disappearance remain one of the great medical mysteries of the past. The legacy of sweating sickness is not just one of biological devastation, but of cultural trauma. It exposed the vulnerability of even the most powerful. It showed that wealth, nobility, and status offered no protection. In a world without antibiotics or vaccines, all were equal before disease. And in that fear, something shifted. Society became more attuned to the reality of death, not just for the poor or the old, but for everyone. The disease reinforced the transient nature of life and the limits of human understanding. In many ways, it paved the way for deeper inquiries into public health, even if it would take centuries more to bear fruit. The English sweat remains a chilling example of how fragile life could be in the Middle Ages. a silent, swift, and selective killer that left no trace but fear and questions that still echo into modern times. Water elf disease of witchcraft, herbs, and fear of the unseen. As strange as it sounds, water elf disease, a term that now feels more mythical than medical, was very real in the minds of those who lived during the early medieval period. Thought to be caused not by infection, but by witchcraft or supernatural interference, this bizarre illness reveals the deeply spiritual and fearful lens through which people of the time viewed health and disease. Symptoms of water elf disease included itchy red spots, inflamed eyes that watered constantly, darkened fingernails, extreme fatigue, and fever. Sufferers often complained of unexplained pains in their limbs, sudden fainting spells, and a sensation of being stabbed or pierced, a condition sometimes attributed to a witch's curse or the mischief of unseen beings, the so-called water elves. The most well-known medieval treatment for this disease was nothing short of a ritual. 13 herbs were gathered and placed in a sacred vessel, which was then set beneath the altar of a church. 9 full masses were sung over it. The herbs were then boiled with butter, sheep's fat, and salt. The resulting ointment would be applied to the affected person's forehead, eyes, and any red patches on the body. A variation involved drinking ale infused with plants while chanting incantations to lift the spell. Such methods, though far removed from scientific medicine, were common and accepted in a world where disease was often understood as the result of sin, curses, or cosmic imbalance. Diagnosis was based not on observation under a microscope, but on dreams, divine signs, and medieval texts like the Leech Book of Bald, a 10th century Anglo-Saxon medical compendium that blended herbalism with prayer and magic. What might have caused water elf disease in reality? Modern historians and scientists speculate that it could have been any number of conditions: measles, chickenpox, or even endocarditis, an infection of the inner lining of the heart. But in the absence of modern terminology, people saw what they could understand: supernatural beings, divine wrath, or malevolent neighbors dabbling in the dark arts. The existence of this disease and its treatment practices speaks volumes about how the medieval world interpreted suffering. Disease, the pox, great and small, marks that never faded. While some diseases of the medieval world vanished into mystery, others left unmistakable marks, both on their victims and on human history. Among the most infamous were smallpox and syphilis, known respectively as the smallpox and great pox. These two afflictions terrorized continents and defined the limits of medical knowledge and social tolerance in their time. Smallpox had been around for centuries, likely originating in Asia before being introduced to Europe by soldiers returning from the Crusades in the 11th and 12th centuries. Unlike many other medieval diseases that came and went in terrifying bursts, smallpox was a slow, relentless presence. It began innocently enough: fever, chills, nausea, but quickly escalated. Within days, the body would erupt in a rash that turned into blistering pustules, which hardened, burst, and scabbed over. For survivors, the aftermath was permanent: pitted, scarred skin, and, in some cases, blindness. The death rate was horrifying. Up to 30% of sufferers died, with infants and children especially vulnerable. Those who survived bore the emotional and physical trauma for life. Smallpox was so feared that people often isolated loved ones in barns or outhouses to try to limit its spread. Yet isolation was rarely successful in crowded cities, where the disease passed easily from one person to the next. But if smallpox was a lingering horror, syphilis was a thunderclap. Bursting onto the European stage at the end of the 15th century, syphilis was first recorded during the French invasion of Naples in 1494. Italian doctors, observing its gruesome symptoms, named it the French disease. The French, in turn, called it the Neapolitan disease, and the blame game continued across Europe. Regardless of name, it spread like wildfire. Unlike smallpox, which left its mark on the skin, syphilis dug deeper into flesh, bone, and mind. Early symptoms included genital sores, but later stages could cause massive skin eruptions, greenish pustules, and painful ulcers. The flesh could literally rot away, particularly on the face. Victims endured migraines, blindness, dementia, and, in the end, death. In some cases, sufferers developed madness so severe it led to erratic or violent behavior, which, tragically, was sometimes mistaken for demonic possession. Others would slowly wither, isolated by shame and stigma. Because syphilis was sexually transmitted, it became a moral disease in the eyes of many, linked with promiscuity and sin. Medieval treatments were often worse than the disease. Mercury, known even then to be dangerous, was rubbed onto the skin, ingested, or used in steam baths. Physicians believed it would sweat out the illness. But instead of curing, mercury frequently caused poisoning, leading to neurological damage, tooth loss, and death. Other cures included bloodletting, olive oil baths, and even drinking gold dissolved in wine. The distinction between small and great pox became important in an age when terminology had legal, spiritual, and social consequences. Smallpox was viewed as a plague of the masses, syphilis, a curse of indulgence. One killed quickly but indiscriminately. The other lingered, shaming and mutilating its victims. The impact of these diseases rippled outward into politics, religion, and art. Artists painted the ravaged faces of the sick. Kings made public proclamations banning syphilitics from city streets. Hospitals created special wards. Churches added prayers for those suffering from secret sins. In the centuries that followed, smallpox would eventually be conquered by science, its eradication through vaccination one of humanity's greatest achievements. Syphilis, too, would be subdued by antibiotics, though not medieval medicine. Blood, bile, and belief medicine in the Middle Ages was a curious blend of ancient philosophy, religious doctrine, and a pinch of guesswork. Rooted in the teachings of Greek and Roman physicians such as Hippocrates and Galen, the practice of medicine revolved around the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. It was believed that health could only be achieved when these humors were in perfect balance, and that disease arose when they were not. This belief led to a host of now bizarre treatments. Physicians, many of whom were monks trained in monastic infirmaries, would examine a patient's urine, taste it, study its color, and even smell it to determine what imbalance had occurred. Diagnosis might also involve astrology, dreams, or religious interpretation. Once the problem was identified, treatments were applied to restore balance, regardless of how brutal or ineffective they were. Bloodletting was among the most common practices. Doctors would cut open a vein or apply leeches to draw blood from the body, believing it would relieve fevers or calm hysteria. Cauterization was used not only to close wounds, but also to burn out disease. A red-hot iron was applied to the skin, causing excruciating pain and often severe damage, but it was seen as a necessary evil to drive out infection or spiritual corruption. Herbal remedies were more gentle, but often equally misguided. Recipes could include mandrake, henbane, and poppy to relieve pain, or even ground-up gemstones for purification. Apothecaries mixed potions from herbs, animal parts, and minerals, many of which had some small basis in real pharmacology. However, dosage and application were inconsistent, and the effects were unpredictable. In times of crisis, such as during plague outbreaks, the people turned to the church. Disease was believed to be divine punishment, a result of sin or moral failing. Therefore, no healing could begin without confession, penance, and prayer. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 even decreed that priests must absolve a patient's sins before a physician could administer treatment. Hospitals, though they existed, were more places of refuge than recovery. Staffed by religious orders, they focused on caring for the soul rather than curing the body. Patients were fed, prayed over, and made comfortable as they prepared for what was often inevitable: death. Despite the grim outlook, medieval medicine laid the groundwork for future advancement. The translation of Arabic medical texts, the slow emergence of medical universities in places like Salerno and Montpellier, and the resilience of those who dared to question tradition began to shift the tides of thought. The path to modern medicine was long, often painful, and littered with superstition. But it began here, in smoky infirmaries, beside bleeding patients, and in whispered prayers for salvation. Shadows and lessons from the past the Middle Ages were an era where disease was not just a fact of life, it was a defining force. From the plague ships that docked at Sicilian ports, to the leper bells ringing in village streets, to the quiet terror of an unknown fever sweeping through a noble household, illness touched every aspect of life. It shaped how people built cities, how they worshipped, and how they viewed themselves and their place in the cosmos. Death was ever present. It did not lurk only in battlefields or dark forests, but in the home, the church, and the cradle. Diseases claimed the rich and poor alike, and although divine will was often blamed, there was always a desperate search for patterns, meaning, and hope. From ergot-laced bread to airborne pestilence, from the madness of syphilis to the myths of water elves, each disease told its own story, and each left a scar on medieval society. But amid the darkness, there was resilience. Communities found ways to care for the sick, even when cures were impossible. Healers experimented. Physicians took notes. Monasteries copied texts that preserved ancient medical knowledge. The slow march toward modern science began not in well-lit laboratories, but in candlelit scriptoria and bloody surgical chambers. We often look back on the medieval world with a mixture of horror and pity. But there is something deeply human in how people responded to fear with faith, to suffering with solidarity, and to death with meaning. They may not have had vaccines or antiseptics, but they had ritual, belief, and above all, a determination to endure. Today, with the benefit of antibiotics, sanitation, and vaccines, we can afford to look at these diseases as distant shadows. But those shadows stretch long. Pandemics still reshape our world. Misinformation still spreads. Fear still dominates. And just like in the Middle Ages, our response, whether guided by science, compassion, or belief, defines who we are. So as we look back on the horrors of medieval disease, we should also look forward with humility. We are not so far removed from those times as we might think. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: in the face of death, the human spirit still fights, questions, and hopes. Thank you for joining us on this journey through medieval madness. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and never take your health for granted.